Welcome to part 2 of The Wine Merchant. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for an awesome collection of unique, full-length audiobooks. And be sure to subscribe to be notified when new books are released. Chapter 4. Bostick was awakened the next morning by a sense of movement nearby rather than by any sound. He hadn't fallen asleep quickly after settling down. The novelty of his situation, combined with the cramped and somewhat lumpy bed formed by the locker, along with the scent of oils, had left him restless. But most of all, his conversation with Gibbons had kept sleep at bay, as he lay there contemplating the adventure they had chosen and listening to the gentle murmur and gurgle of the water flowing past the pilings and lapping against the woodwork beside him. The launch swayed slightly, rocking back and forth in the current as its mooring ropes tightened and loosened, occasionally trembling softly as it brushed against the wharf. He heard the city clocks chime the hour 3 times before a pleasant drowsiness finally washed over him, and he began to drift into sleep. But as soon as the shuffling started, he stirred, feeling slightly wronged, and opened his eyes to discover the cabin bathed in light from the flickering reflections of sunlit waves dancing across the ceiling, with Gibbons getting dressed on the opposite locker, the source of the disturbance. "Good morning," Gibbons called cheerfully. "You're awake. It's 4:45 and the day looks lovely." "Can't be," Bostick replied, stretching luxuriously. "I just heard it strike 2 seconds ago." Gibbons chuckled. "Well, it's high time we got moving anyway," he said. "The tide's on its way out now. We'll catch a nice push down to the sea." Bostick got up and peeked out of the porthole above his locker. "Are we going to jump over the side?" he asked. "Wow, just look at that sunlight." "Absolutely, but let's hold off for an hour or so until we're further away from town. I think the water will be more inviting downriver. We can stop for a swim and then be good to go for breakfast." "Sounds good to me. You handle things your way, and I'll take a crack at tidying up this mess you've got lying around." Gibbons stepped out of the cabin, and soon enough a loud clatter and rumble indicated that the engines had fired up. The noise settled into a pleasant hum, and then a shout came from the front. "Give us a hand with the ropes, will you?" Bostick hurried to finish getting dressed, and made his way onto the deck, pausing despite himself to take in the scene before tackling the lines. The sun hung low over the opposite bank, casting a dazzling glare across the river all the way to the railway bridge. Only the southern end of the vast structure was visible, emerging from the bright light, as well as the houses along the western bank, which stood out with striking contrast between the bright highlights and dark shadows. From their position, they couldn't see the broad curve of the quays, and even with the brilliant atmosphere, the town looked dull and uninviting. "It's going to be hot," Gibbons said. "Let's start with the bow, if you don't mind." He engaged the screw, keeping the launch close to the wharf while Bostick untied the bow, and then the stern ropes. Then, steering towards the center of the river, he swung around, and they began to glide rapidly downstream with the current. As they passed beneath the massive railway bridge, a clearer view of the city unfolded, its rather lackluster buildings huddled along the grand curve of the river to the left, with the impressive stone bridge they had crossed the night before arching over the water before them. They maneuvered through one of its 17 arches, slipping past the lengthy quays filled with moored vessels, until the houses grew sparse and they entered the countryside. About 12 miles downstream, Gibbons cut the engines, and as the launch settled in the swift current, they enjoyed a refreshing dip, taking turns. The smell of hot ham mingled in the cabin with the sense of paraffin and burnt petrol, making for an even more delightful breakfast. Finally, the engines roared to life again, and they moved steadily down the ever-widening estuary. Around 9, they caught their first glimpse of the sea on the horizon, and shortly afterward, a gentle rise reminded Bostick of the motion he would soon have to brace for. The sea was calm like a pond, but as they emerged from behind the Point de Grave, they began to feel the pull of the slow, rolling swells of the ocean. Once it seemed safe, Gibbons steered south along the coast. The swells came at them from the side, but they were so large in comparison to the launch that it hardly rolled. Instead, it was lifted and lowered smoothly on an almost even keel. Although Bostick wasn't truly seasick, he felt deeply unsettled and sighed with relief when around 5 o'clock they turned east and entered the estuary of the Lesk. "We need to take it slow here," Gibbons said as the banks began to close in. "There isn't a sailing chart for this river, so we'll have to navigate carefully." For about 2 miles, they passed through a stretch of sand dunes, tall yellow hills speckled with dark green where grasses had stubbornly taken root. Beyond that, the land flattened out, and small, scraggly shrubs began to appear, all leaning towards the east in testament to the fierce winds coming off the sea. Further along, these shrubs gave way to stunted trees, and after traveling 10 or 12 miles, they found themselves in a pine forest. Soon they passed beneath a large girder bridge that carried the railway from Bordeaux to Bayonne and the south. "We can't be far from the mill now," Gibbons said a little later. "I estimate it's about 3 miles upstream from the railway." They crept slowly against the current. The engines were running smoothly, producing only a quiet hum that was barely audible even nearby. The stream here was narrow, barely 100 yards across, with tall, straight pines leaning down to the water's edge on both sides. Although it was only 7 o'clock, dusk was creeping into the narrow channel, prompting Gibbons to think about where they would moor for the night. "We'll go around that next bend," he decided, "and search for a place to anchor." A few minutes later, they maneuvered close to a gently sloping bank and quietly lowered the anchor about 20 feet from the shore. "Thank goodness we got that anchor down," Gibbons said, stretching out. "It's 8 o'clock, and we've been at this since 5 this morning. Let's have some supper and a pipe, then we can discuss our plans." "What plans do you have?" Bostick asked, an hour later as they lounged on their lockers, Gibbons with his pipe and Bostick with a cigar. "Tomorrow, I thought I'd take the collapsible boat upstream until I reach the works, then land on the opposite bank to keep an eye on what's happening at the mill. I figured I'd bring my binoculars and stay hidden. Given what you said last night, you probably won't want to join me, so I was going to suggest that if you'd like to fish, you find everything you need in that forward locker. We can meet back here in the evening, and I'll tell you if I spotted anything interesting." Bostick removed his cigar from his lips and sat up on the locker. "Listen, old man," he said, "I'm sorry for being a bit short last night. I'm not sure what got into me. I've thought about what you said, and I agree your perspective is the right one. If you'll have me, I'm committed to this until we're both sure there's no danger to either Miss Slatton or our country." Gibbons sprang to his feet and extended his hand. "Cheers," he exclaimed. "I'm really glad you feel that way. That's all I want to do, too. But I can't pretend my intentions are completely selfless. Just think of the recognition we'd both get if we uncover something. I wouldn't count on it too much. I'm not, but there's always that chance." The next morning, the two friends retrieved the collapsible boat, locked up the launch, and paddled gently up the river until they spotted the galvanized roof of the Slatton house peeking through the trees. They made landfall on the opposite bank, disassembling the boat and hiding the pieces under a fallen trunk. Then, sheltered by the trees, they continued on foot. It was just past 7, and another beautifully clear morning promised more heat. The woods were quiet, though a soft buzz of life surrounded them, the hum of unseen insects, the distant songs of birds, and the gentle murmur of flowing water. Their footsteps fell softly on the patchy grass and decaying pine needles. There seemed to be a tranquility over everything, as if they were wandering through the pillars of a vast cathedral, inhaling not incense, but the sweet aroma of the pines. They moved forward, stifling the urge to walk on tiptoe, until they spotted the galvanized iron of the shed through the trees. A bit further upstream, the clearing had allowed some stunted shrubs to grow along the riverbank. Seeing these offered decent cover, the two men crawled forward and settled into their hiding spot. The bank at that point rose slightly higher than the opposite side, granting them a good view of the wharf and mill, as well as the clearing overall. The land was shaped like a D, with the river forming the straight edge. About halfway up this edge stood the mill, and midway between it and the top were the shrubs behind which the watchers were concealed. On the far side of the mill, behind a thicket of shrubs and at the base of the D-pillar, stood the Slattins' house, perched on a small hill. "This spot is perfect for watching things," Gibbons said, relaxing and placing his binoculars on the ground beside him. "From here, we won't miss a thing." "Right now, there's not much to see," Bostick replied, casually scanning the vacant space. Around 7:45, a man appeared where the lane from the road opened up into the clearing. He walked towards the shed and soon disappeared behind it. Almost immediately, blue smoke began to rise from the metal chimney on the shed roof. Clearly, he had arrived early to get the boiler up to steam. In about half an hour, the others showed up, around 15 men in worn work clothes. They also slipped behind the shed, but most of them quickly re-emerged, carrying tools, and broke off into groups, heading for the edge of the clearing. Before long, the place was buzzing with activity. One group was cutting down trees, another was lopping the branches off fallen trunks, while a third was loading the stripped logs onto a deck-level railway leading back to the shed. The high-pitched screech of the saws pierced through the sounds of chopping and the calls of the workers. "Everything seems in order here," Bostick noted after they had surveyed the scene for nearly an hour. "Yeah," Gibbons replied, "and it looked fine when I checked it on Sunday. But if something were amiss, it wouldn't be easy to spot. It's likely to be something hidden." Around 9 o'clock, Mr. Slattin, dressed in grey flannel, stepped out of his house and walked across the grass to the mill. He stayed there for a few minutes before heading over to the workers at the edge of the forest. He spent some time with each group before making his way back to his house. For nearly an hour, everything continued as usual, until Mr. Slattin appeared at his front door, this time accompanied by his daughter. They were dressed exceptionally well for such a remote area, he in a grey Homburg hat and gloves, and she in a brown outfit that included a well-tailored coat and skirt, paired with a stylish toque and motoring veil. Both carried dust coats. Mr. Slattin closed the door behind them, and they walked toward the mill, disappearing from view. A few minutes passed, and amid the screeching of the saws, the sound of a motor engine became audible. After a brief delay, a Ford emerged from behind the shed and moved slowly over the uneven ground towards the road. Inside the car were Mr. and Miss Slattin, along with a chauffeur. Gibbons had been watching their every move through his binoculars, and he quickly handed them to his companion, whispering excitedly. "Look, Bostick, is that the lorry driver you saw?" Bostick focused the binoculars on the chauffeur and immediately recognized him. It was the same dark, hawk-faced man who had glared at him resentfully during his first visit to the mill 2 months earlier. "Goodness, what an incredible stroke of luck!" Gibbons exclaimed eagerly. "All 3 of them who know you are gone. We can head down there now and ask for Mr. Slattin, and maybe we'll even get a chance to see inside that shed. Let's go right away, before they come back." They moved carefully from their hiding spot in the woods, retraced their steps to the boat, reassembled it, and carried it to the river. After rowing upstream, they reached the end of the wharf, where a set of wooden steps led into the water. They disembarked after securing the boat to the woodwork. The front of the wharf, which they had observed from the boat, was rugged but sturdy. At the very edge, there was a row of nearly vertical piles, pine trees driven into the ground without being squared off. Behind these structures was a second row, leaning slightly inward. The feet of both rows aligned closely, but the tops of the angled row were about 6 feet behind the others, creating a shape that resembled a V, with one side standing tall. These tops were joined by beams that supported a wooden floor. Behind the stilted piles, rough tree trunks were stacked on top of each other, forming a barrier to hold back the earth that had been placed behind them. The front stretched roughly 100 feet and jutted out about 30 feet into the river. Parallel to the front, about 50 feet behind, stood the shed's wall. It had 4 doors, all shut tight, but from each door ran a line of narrow-gauge railway. These tracks extended to the front of the wharf, connecting to turntables that joined a crossover line, clearly designed for the efficient movement of loaded carts that could exit one door, be unloaded, and then return empty through another. Stacks of timber awaited loading between the tracks. "It's a solid setup," Gibbons remarked as they examined the site. Absolutely. Everything I've noticed so far strikes me as well organized. After surveying all that the wharf had to offer, they rounded the end of the shed. At the back, several doors stood, and through these, narrow-gauge tracks extended, linking to those leading to the edge of the clearing. Throughout, stacks of timber and various blocks lined the spaces between the tracks. 3 or 4 of the doors were ajar, and in front of one of them, engaged in conversation with someone inside, stood a man. Soon he noticed them and turned. Without hesitation, Gibbons approached him. "Good morning. We're looking for Mr. Slatton. Is he around?" "No, sir," the man replied politely. "He has gone into Bordeaux. He won't be back until this afternoon." "That's too bad for us," Gibbons replied casually. "My friend and I were cruising up the river on our launch, and we were hoping to see him, but we can always catch him later. This is quite the operation you have here." The man smiled. He appeared to be of a higher caliber than the others, and was clearly a foreman. "Not too shabby, sir. We have 4 saws, but only 2 are operational today." He gestured toward the door behind him as he spoke, and the 2 friends walked inside to take a look around. The interior resembled any other sawmill, but a sense of design and efficiency was evident here as well. The foreman explained the process. The trimmed trunks arrived through one of 2 pathways via a large door in the center of the building. Outside each pathway, there was a saw with its axle running parallel to the road. The logs were grabbed with claws, lifted onto the saw tables, and continuously moved to be cut into lengths ranging from 7 to 10 feet. The pieces intended for props were sent onto a conveyor that carried them out of the shed to be stacked for seasoning and export. The rejected pieces were sent via another conveyor to the 3rd and 4th saws, where they were cut into blocks for firewood and ultimately delivered into 2 large bins, ready for loading onto the trucks. The friends feigned enough casual interest to linger for quite some time, engaging the foreman in conversation and taking in as much as they could. At one end of the shed was the boiler house and engine room, while at the other the office sat next to a spacious garage, where they were informed 6 trucks belonging to the syndicate were parked. 3 vehicles were present, 2 sat idle, while the 3rd, its engine running and loaded with blocks, was prepared to roll out. They would have preferred to inspect the number plate, but with the foreman present, it was nearly impossible. Eventually, they made their way across the clearing to where the cutting and trimming were taking place, and observed the work being done. When they left shortly after, promising to return and meet Mr. Slatton, they felt they had noted everything significant about the place. "That operation is above board," Bostick asserted once they were back in the boat. "And that foreman is trustworthy too. I'd bet my life he's not hiding anything. He simply isn't clever enough for it." "I think you're right," Gibbons agreed. "But what's the deal with the number plates? What's their purpose?" "I couldn't say. Still, I'll swear there's nothing fishy about the timber trade. It's a dead end, Gibbons. Let's stop chasing shadows and continue with our trip." "I'm inclined to agree," Gibbons replied, puffing thoughtfully on his pipe. "We'll keep an eye out for another day or so, and if nothing seems off, we can take off." But that very evening, a small incident reignited all their suspicions, plunging them back into uncertainty. Thinking the Slattons would have returned by then, they left the launch around 5 o'clock to pay a visit. Approaching the edge of the clearing directly behind the house, they walked around to the front and knocked. The door was opened by Miss Slatton herself. The sun was shining directly in her eyes, making it difficult for her to see her visitors clearly. "You must be the gentleman who wanted to speak with Mr. Slatton, I assume," she said before Bostick could reply. "He's at the works. You'll find him in his office." Bostick took a step forward, removing his cap. "Don't you remember me, Miss Slatton?" he asked earnestly. "I had the pleasure of meeting you in May when you were kind enough to give me petrol to get to Bordeaux." Miss Slatton scrutinized him more closely, and her previously polite yet reserved demeanor shifted dramatically. Her face went pale, and she instinctively pressed her hand to her side, as if trying to steady the rapid beating of her heart. For a moment she struggled to find her voice, but after a visible effort she responded, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "Mr. Bostick, isn't it? Of course I remember you. Please come in. My father will be back soon." As she regained her composure, by the time Bostick had introduced Gibbons, her demeanor had almost returned to normal. She led them into a comfortably furnished sitting room that overlooked the river. "Gibbons and I are taking a motor launch tour across France," Bostick continued. "He worked his way from England down the coast to Bordeaux, where I joined him. We hope to eventually travel across the country to the Mediterranean and explore the Riviera from the water." "How perfectly delightful," Miss Slatten replied. "I envy you." "Yes, it's quite lovely navigating these rivers and canals," Gibbons chimed in. "I've spent a couple of holidays that way, and it's always been worthwhile." As they chatted in the pleasant room, the girl seemed to have fully regained her composure, yet Bostick sensed a certain restraint in her manner and a look of concern in her bright brown eyes. It was clear something was troubling her, and that something seemed to be linked to him. But he reasoned that nothing about him could possibly be the cause of her anxiety, unless it was indeed the matter of the number plates. Felt an overwhelming urge to share in her troubles, whatever they might be, wishing to let her know that he would do anything to bring her joy. In fact, he longed to hold her close and offer her comfort. Just then, footsteps in the hall announced Mr. Slatten's return. "In here, Daddy," his daughter called out, and the footsteps drew closer to the door. By chance or intention, Miss Slatten was seated directly across from the door, while her two guests were placed just out of view for anyone entering. Gibbons, watching the girl's expression as her father entered, caught a look that seemed to signal a warning. His gaze quickly shifted to the newcomer, and he noticed a flicker of surprise and concern cross Mr. Slatten's face as he recognized his visitor. It was so brief that if he hadn't been observing so closely, he might have missed it. Yet, even though it was subtle, it added weight to the other signs, indicating that there was a hidden issue between them, one that apparently also involved the attractive driver and had some connection to the lorry's license plates. Mr. Slatten was polite, smooth, and well-mannered, truly a man of the world. But there was an underlying coolness in his demeanor. Gibbons sensed a hidden hostility. A few careful questions allowed him to gather details about the traveler's supposed plans, which he addressed with genuine curiosity. "But," he said to Gibbons, "I'm afraid you're mistaken in trying to navigate up the River Lesque. The canal you're looking for is the Midi. It connects to the Mediterranean not far from Narbonne. However, the route from this side leads from the Girondin. You really should have gone upstream to Langon, nearly 40 miles above Bordeaux." "We were hoping to go even farther south," Gibbons replied. "I've explored quite a few of the rivers, or at least I have, and we came up here to see the sand dunes and the forests of the lands, which are new to me. It's a very bleak area, isn't it?" Mr. Slatten nodded in agreement, speaking kindly. "I'm just glad your explorations have led you to our part of the world. We don't often get visitors here, so it's nice to speak our own language with someone outside our household. If you don't mind a simple meal, we would both be delighted." He glanced at his daughter. "If you would join us for dinner now. Tomorrow you could explore the woods, which are worth seeing even if they are a bit monotonous. And if you're interested, I'd love to show you our little workshop. Just a word of warning, it's my passion as well as my work at the moment, so I might assume you share my enthusiasm. Don't hesitate to tell me if I'm boring you." Gibbons, somewhat wary and observant, wondered if he had caught a slight exchange of glances between the father and daughter. He couldn't be sure, but the girl was quick to support her father's invitation. "I really hope you'll stay for dinner," she said. "As he mentioned, we see so few visitors, and even fewer English people, that it would be a kindness. I suppose that's not the most flattering thing to say," she laughed warmly, "but at least it's honest." They decided to stay and enjoyed their evening. Mr. Slatten proved to be an engaging host, and his conversation, though laced with satire, was captivating. He and Gibbons discussed various topics while Bostick, who dabbled in music, tried out some songs with Miss Slatten. If it hadn't been for the nagging feeling that they were, in some sense, playing the role of spies, the evening would have been utterly delightful for the visitors. Before they headed out for the launch, they had planned to stay over the next day, have lunch with the Slattens, and take a hike through the forest in the afternoon. They bid their farewells with warm expressions of goodwill. "Hey, Bostick," Gibbons said eagerly as they walked back through the woods, "did you see how your unexpected arrival rattled them both? There's no doubt about it, something going on. What it is, I can't say, but there's definitely something." "Whatever it is, it's not wrong," Bostick insisted stubbornly. "Not in the way you're thinking, no," Gibbons conceded, "but still, something isn't right. Now that I've met Miss Slatton, I can see you were right about her, but anyone with half a mind can tell she's anxious and disturbed about something. She needs help." "Damn it, Gibbons, what are you saying?" Bostick snapped, overcome by a surge of irrational anger. "There's nothing wrong and no need for us to meddle. Let's just leave and continue our trip." Gibbons smiled in the shadows. "And Miss Lunch, and our outing with the Slattons tomorrow?" he asked playfully. "You know exactly what I mean," Bostick replied, his irritation growing. "Let's set aside this nonsense about plots and mysteries and try to think clearly. Here," he continued forcefully as Gibbons hesitated, "I'll tell you what I'll do if it'll make you happy. I won't spy or jump to conclusions, but I'll simply ask her if something is wrong. I'll say I got that impression from how she was acting and ask her directly. Would that satisfy you?" "And you'll just end up embarrassed for your trouble," Gibbons shot back. "You've tried that once before already. Why didn't you press for more information about the license plate when she mentioned the driver's shell shock?" Bostick paused for a moment, then exclaimed, "Well, come on, what are you suggesting we do?" That evening, Gibbons had conjured an idea, and now he brought it up again. "I'll tell you," he spoke slowly, instinctively lowering his voice. "We need to watch their steamer being loaded. I've been mulling it over. We need to see what, if anything, goes on that boat besides pit-props." Bostick merely grunted in response, but Gibbons, noticing his mood, felt satisfied. Meanwhile, Bostick lay awake that night on the port locker of the Swallow, beginning to comprehend his own state of mind, and realizing that his entire future and happiness rested in the delicate hands of Madeleine Slatton. Chapter 5. The morning found both friends in a gloomy mood, wrapped up in their own thoughts. Bostick was deeply lost in contemplation of the new element that had entered his life. This wasn't the first time he had thought he was in love. Like many men of his age, he had experienced relationships of various intensities, all of which had eventually faded away. But this time felt different. He was convinced he had finally met the one woman for him, and the feeling filled him with a sense of awe and elation, consuming his mind entirely. Gibbons, on the other hand, was preoccupied with a different concern. He was carefully considering his plan to keep a close watch on the loading of the Syndicate's ship. He believed that if they could observe it closely enough, they might finally resolve the smuggling issue. In his mind, no item could be shipped in large quantities without being noticed by a well-hidden observer. Even if it were a liquid, like brandy, being sent aboard through a flexible pipe, it would surely attract attention. But two unexpected challenges had presented themselves since the night before. First, they had formed a friendship with the Slattons. They were planning outings together, and one had already been scheduled for that very day. They had been invited to make the manager's house their base during their stay, indicating that both parties were expected to spend a significant amount of time in each other's company. Given this situation, how could the friends sneak away to observe the boat's loading? Then it struck Gibbons that perhaps this was a matter of design, that Mr. Slatton might have intentionally created this obstacle to keep himself and Bostick under surveillance, rendering them harmless. He realized this was mere speculation, but it still felt like a possibility. As he struggled to devise a solution to this predicament, he finally arrived at a plan. They would politely excuse themselves from their hosts as soon as possible and return to Bordeaux, pretending they were resuming their journey east. From there they would step out onto the clearing, following the road, and from the lookout they had previously used, they would keep a close watch on the ship's arrival and whatever followed. At night, they might even be able to hide out on the wharf itself. In any case, they would certainly notice if anything other than pit-props was being loaded. So far, so good, but there was another, more difficult issue. Would Bostick agree to this plan and lend a hand? Gibbons had his doubts. The fact that his friend had clearly fallen for this Madeleine Slatten was an unexpected and unfortunate twist. He could, of course, appeal to Bostick by saying the girl was in danger and needed help, but he had already tried that with disappointing results. Still, he felt he had no choice but to do his best to convince Bostick. So, while they enjoyed their after-breakfast pipes, he brought up the topic. But as he feared, his friend wasn't having any of it. "I'm telling you, I won't do anything like that," Bostick said, his voice rising in anger. "Here we are, two strangers inserting ourselves where we don't belong, and we're met with kindness and hospitality and invited to a family gathering. Good Lord, Gibbons, I can't believe you'd suggest this. Surely you can't think the Slattens are smuggling brandy." "Of course not, you old hothead," Gibbons replied with a chuckle, "but I do believe, and so must you, that something odd is happening. We need to make sure there's nothing sinister involved. Come on, old friend, will you help me with that?" "If I thought anything was amiss, you know I'd jump in to help," Bostick said, his tone softening a bit. "But I don't. It's completely ridiculous to suggest the Slattens are up to anything illegal, and if you concede that, your entire case crumbles." Gibbons realized that for the moment, he wouldn't be able to persuade him further. He decided to drop the subject, and they moved on to other topics until it was time to go ashore. Lunch with their new acquaintances was enjoyable, and afterward, the two friends accompanied Mr. Slatten to tour the operations. Gibbons thought it best to mention that they had already seen some of the facilities the day before, but despite this reassurance, Mr. Slatten insisted they take a thorough look around again. He guided them through every detail, and when the tour concluded, both men were even more convinced that the business was legitimate, and that nothing untoward was happening beyond the expected trade. Mr. Slatten shared his thoughts on the enterprise, and his insights seemed so reasonable and straightforward that Gibbons's earlier suspicions began to fade. He found himself questioning whether their host's odd demeanor might stem from something other than what he had assumed. "There isn't as much profit in the Pit-Props as I had hoped," Mr. Slatten explained. "When we started here, the Baltic trade, which was, of course, the major market before the war, hadn't picked up. Now, we're seeing more fierce competition from the Baltic, and our profit margins are shrinking. We're also at a disadvantage, since we only have a one-way trade. Most of the Baltic firms exporting Pit-Props also import coal. This gives them extra freight opportunities and reduces their overall costs. However, it wouldn't be worth it for us to follow that model. If we were to handle coal, it could only be to Bordeaux, and that would take up more of our boat's time than we could profit from." Gibbons nodded as Mr. Slatten continued, on a brighter note, "We're doing better in what I might call side ventures. We're getting a decent price for our firewood, and sales are increasing. 3 large companies in Bordeaux have installed wood-burning fireboxes exclusively, and 2 others are considering making the switch. I'm also looking into 2 potential developments. In fact, I've already made a decision on the first. We're planning to install an air compressor in the engine room and use pneumatic tools in the forest for cutting and trimming trees. I estimate this will save us 6 men. I also believe there's potential for a market for pine paving blocks for streets. I haven't delved into that yet, but it's on my agenda." "That sounds quite promising," Gibbons replied. "I'm not an expert, but I think softwood blocks are considered superior to hardwood ones. They wear more evenly, if I'm correct. I'm trying to convince the authorities in Paris to test a sample, and if it goes well, it could turn into something significant. In fact, I can envision us phasing out Pit-Props altogether in the future." After a while, Miss Slatten joined them, and once the Ford car was ready, they set off on their outing. They visited a section of the woods where the trees were larger than those near the sawmill, enjoying a pleasant yet uneventful afternoon. They spent the evening at the Slatten home, as before. The next day, their friends invited their hosts to join them for a trip up the river. Gibbons skillfully engaged the manager with the various gadgets he had installed in the launch, and Bostick's dream of making tea with Miss Slatten began to take shape. The more time he spent with the gentle, brown-eyed girl, the more he felt his heart drawn to her, and he realized that a life without her was becoming a daunting thought he couldn't bear. They traveled upstream on the rising tide for about 20 miles, until the forest thinned and they reached vineyards. There they went ashore, and it was not until dusk began to settle that they returned to the clearing. As they rounded the bend and caught sight of the wharf, Mr. Slatton exclaimed, "Well, look at that. There's the Girondin. She made excellent time. We weren't expecting her for another 3 or 4 hours." At the wharf rested a ship of about 300 tons, with a broad, rounded bow that sat high out of the water, a long, straight hull, and a cluster of deckhouses at the stern. "A motor vessel," Mr. Slatton said, beaming with pride. "We had her custom-built for carrying pit-props and for navigating this river. She only draws 8 feet. You must come aboard and take a look." This was precisely what Gibbons wanted. He understood that if he could thoroughly inspect the ship, it would finally erase any lingering doubts he might still have about whether the syndicate was involved in smuggling. The 2 reasons for his suspicion, the absence of return cargoes and the location of the French end of the operation, didn't seem suspicious anymore. Mr. Slatton's comment addressed the first point, showing he was well aware of the challenge presented by one-way traffic. This concern hadn't mattered much when the industry began, but now, with the Baltic trade recovering after the war, it was becoming increasingly important. The manager clearly understood that this could grow substantial enough to threaten the pit-prop trade entirely. As for the location, the syndicate had chosen the pine forests of the lands for a straightforward reason. They needed timber close to the sea. Additionally, the lack of secrecy surrounding the ship only indicated that there was nothing to hide. When they reached the wharf, all 4 crossed the gangway to the deck of the Girondin. Up close, the ship appeared quite impressive. At the bow was a small forecastle containing quarters for the crew of 5, along with oil tanks and supplies. Amidships, there was a long stretch of holds, while at the back were the officers' cabins, a tiny mess room, a galley navigating bridge, and last but not least, the engine room, equipped with a set of diesel engines. The boat was clearly outfitted with care. It was evident that no expense had been spared to ensure her efficiency and comfort. "She carries between 6,000 and 7,000 props on each trip," Mr. Slatton explained. "That's without counting any deck cargo. In summer, we could probably load her with 10,000 if we really wanted to, but she's a bit shallow in the draft for that, and we prefer not to take unnecessary risks. Ah, there's the captain, back already." He paused as a man in a blue pilot's coat and a peaked cap emerged from below deck. The new arrival was strong-built and tall, though slightly stooped with rounded shoulders. He was clean-shaven, with a strong jaw and thin lips pressed into a tight line. His expression had an edge of vindictiveness mixed with a certain cunning, suggesting he was not easily swayed by moral considerations. While Gibbons took note of these details, they didn't particularly interest him. However, he quickly became more alert when he noticed the captain's reaction upon seeing him and Bostick. The man gave a sudden start and shot a quick, questioning glance at Mr. Slatton. It was a fleeting moment, but it reignited all of Gibbons's suspicions. Surely, he thought, there must be something unsettling about the sight of a stranger to provoke such a reaction. Before he could dwell on it, the captain regained his composure, removed his cap for Miss Slatton, and shook hands with everyone as Mr. Slatton introduced the guests. "How was your trip, Captain?" Mr. Slatton inquired. "You're ahead of schedule." "Not too bad," the captain replied, his voice and demeanor surprisingly refined for someone in his position. "We had a good wind at our backs for most of the journey." They exchanged pleasantries for a few moments before starting their inspection tour. Although Gibbons remained alert, the examination seemed to uncover no issues at all. They explored every part of the ship, from the crew's storage rooms to the tunnel housing the propeller shaft, and from the chart room to the depths of the hold. Every question either of the friends posed was met with a thorough and immediate answer. That evening, just like the night before, they spent time with the Slattons. The captain and the engineer, a stocky man named Buller, accompanied them and stayed for dinner, but left shortly after, citing duties to attend to on board. The friends remained, playing bridge, and it was late when they said their goodbyes and started walking back to the launch. Throughout the game, Gibbons's mind was occupied with the mystery he suspected surrounded the syndicate. He resolved that to satisfy his curiosity, he would head down to the wharf that night to see if anything intriguing was happening under the cover of darkness. The thrill of a midnight loading of contraband no longer excited him, but he still felt an urge to ensure no secret activities were underway. He was at least certain that nothing had occurred up to that moment. Mr. Slatton was personally involved in everything, after all. From the instant they first saw the ship until they left the manager's house just 5 minutes ago following their game of bridge, Gibbons had been in Mr. Slatton's presence. They were scheduled to meet again the next day, meaning if the manager intended to carry out any secret dealings, they could only happen at night. When they reached the launch, he turned to Bostick. "You go on ahead, my friend. I'm going to take a look around before calling it a night. Don't wait up for me. Turn off the light when you're finished and leave the companionway unlatched so I can slip in." Bostick grumbled in disapproval, but didn't argue further. He climbed aboard the launch and vanished below deck, while Gibbons remained in the small folding boat, quietly rowing upstream toward the wharf. The night was dark and still, yet warm. The moon hadn't risen, and the sky was overcast, hiding even the faintest light of the stars. A gentle breeze whispered among the trees, while the calm murmur of the water was occasionally broken by tiny splashes and gurgles as eddies formed around the boat's stem and wavelets lapped against the banks. Gibbons's eyes had adjusted to the dimness, allowing him to make out the jagged line of trees flanking him, and further on, the banks of the clearing, softly illuminated by the ghostly shimmer of the water's surface. He moved swiftly, silently, propelling the boat forward, and soon the dark shape of the Girondin came into view. The ship, longer than the wharf, loomed tall above and below it. Gibbons steered his boat toward the shore, intending to slip between the hull and the bank to reach the landing steps. But as he rounded the stern of the vessel, he noticed her starboard side was lit. He halted his rowing, holding the boat still as it began to drift back into the shadows downstream. The wharf towered above him, so he could only see the tops of the pit-prop piles peeking over its edge. These, along with the end of the ship's bridge and the gangway, were illuminated by what he presumed was a lamp on one of the deck houses. The stillness made the area feel deserted. Gibbons had planned to land on the wharf, crouch behind the props, and wait, but now he hesitated. It seemed risky to attempt to reach his hiding spot without stepping into the light and potentially exposing himself to anyone watching from the ship. Remembering that the port side of the vessel lay in darkness, he figured it might be safer to board the ship directly from there. After taking off his shoes, he quietly rowed around the stern, searching for a way to climb aboard. The ship, being lighter at the front, leaned heavily in the back, and he noted that the lower deck was only about 6 or 7 feet above the water. It occurred to him that if he could reach the mooring rope pawls, he might be able to haul himself up. However, after several attempts, he discovered it was impossible. Without someone at the oars to keep the boat steady, it always drifted away from the hull before he could grasp what he needed. He decided to brave the lighted area, and after rowing around the stern for the 3rd time, maneuvered the boat as close to the hull as he could until he reached the wharf. Passing between 2 rows of wooden piles and feeling his way in the darkness, he secured the painter to a diagonal post, ensuring the boat would stay hidden if anyone checked the steps with a light. The hull rested against the vertical piles, and Gibbons slowly edged along a wooden beam toward the front of the wharf, using his foot to fumble through the shadows for the stern belting. The tide was low, and he found it barely a foot above the timber beneath him. He spotted the deck light, an electric bulb fixed to the captain's cabin, which illuminated the top of the taffrail, sitting just above his line of sight. Taking a deep breath, he stepped onto the belting and managed to grab the taffrail. In an instant, he was over it and onto the deck, and in another moment, he had slipped around the deck-house, out of the light's reach. He paused, listening for any signs of alarm, but the silence around him remained unbroken, leading him to believe he had gone unnoticed. He recalled the design of the ship. The lower deck he stood on stretched across the stern, creating a narrow passage about 40 feet long on either side of the central cabin. This cabin housed the galley, the mess room, and the first officer's quarters. Gibbons recalled that Buller's stateroom was located below next to the engine room. 2 ladders from the lower deck led up to the bridge deck, where the captain's stateroom was situated at the front. Behind this structure, the remainder of the bridge deck was taken up by 2 lifeboats, covered in canvas and secure in their chocks. Above the captain's cabin, the bridge and chart house could be accessed by 2 ladders on either side of the cabin. Gibbons, surveying his surroundings, quietly moved to the port side of the ship. The lower deck was completely dark as he passed the line of cabins and silently ascended the steps to the deck above. It was dark here too, but a faint light flickered from the captain's cabin window. With stealth, Gibbons tiptoed over to the porthole. The glass was propped open, but a curtain hung across the opening. Luckily, it wasn't pulled tightly, allowing him to lean against the bridge ladder and peek inside. A quick scan revealed the room was empty. As he hesitated, unsure of his next move, he heard a door open. Footsteps echoed from the deck below, followed by the sound of a door slamming shut. Someone was coming toward the ladder where he stood. Like a shadow, Gibbons slipped back, and as he heard the unknown figure climbing the steps, he searched for a place to hide. The starboard boat and a narrow strip of deck were illuminated, while the port boat remained in shadow, a dark silhouette against the night sky. Realizing he needed to conceal himself if the lights on the port deck were switched on, he reached the boat, carefully felt his way around the stern, and crouched down as far underneath it as he could manage. There he stayed, perfectly still. The newcomer began to slowly walk the deck, the rich aroma of a cigar hanging in the still air. He strolled up and down with a relaxed, unhurried pace, keeping to the shaded side of the ship. Gibbons, though he caught occasional glimmers of the glowing ember of the cigar each time the man reached the stern, could not identify him. Soon, another set of footsteps announced the arrival of someone else. In moments, Gibbons heard the captain's voice. "Where are you, Buller?" "Right here," the engineer responded, his voice emerging from the first man's vicinity. The captain drew near, and the 2 men began pacing together, speaking in low tones. Gibbons could catch snippets of their conversation when they stood close to the stern, but lost the words as they moved toward the front of the poop deck. "Damn that slattern," Gibbons heard Captain Beamish mutter. "What on earth is keeping him so long?" "The young visitors, I imagine," Buller replied with a hearty chuckle. "Our friends from earlier." "Yeah, damn them too," Beamish grumbled, sounding rather irritable. "What a nuisance them showing up unannounced. I wonder what they want." "Probably nothing in particular. Just out, enjoying some kind of holiday." They walked past the deck house, and Gibbons missed Buller's reply. When they returned, Gibbons caught the captain speaking again. "Thinks it would nearly double our profits," he heard. "He's proposing a second depot on the other side, perhaps in Swansea. That would seem sensible, given the South Wales coalfields." "But we're maxing out what we can get from the old girl as it is," Buller countered. "I can't see how she could take on another trip." Archer suggests a second boat. "Oh," the engineer paused before continuing, "but that's not a new idea. That was raised before we even started this." "I know, but the situation has changed. Now we should." Once again, they drifted out of earshot, and Gibbons seized the moment to stretch his cramped limbs. He felt quite intrigued by what he had overheard. Captain Beamish's words about the proposed depot in "look fine because of the coalfields" were a bit puzzling. It felt like there was more to it than met the eye, as if the Pit-Prop business was just a front for something more profitable and potentially more dangerous. It seemed that way at first glance, but Gibbons didn't have time to dwell on it then. The men were coming back. This time, Buller was talking, and Gibbons soon realized he was sharing a rather inappropriate story. As the 2 men rounded the deck house, their laughter echoed across the deck. Then the captain called out, "Is that you, Slattern?" The sound of voices increased, becoming muddled before quickly fading away. A door opened and then shut, plunging the area back into silence. Gibbons sensed an opportunity he couldn't let slip by. Emerging from his hiding spot, he quietly made his way along the deck, eager to discover where the men had gone and what they were discussing. The captain's cabin seemed the most likely place for a meeting, so Gibbons stealthily returned to the window he had peered through earlier. As he got closer, he heard voices murmuring inside. He leaned back against the ladder and cautiously peeked around the partially open curtain. 3 of the room's 4 chairs were now filled. The captain, the engineer, and Mr. Slatton were gathered around a central table, which held a bottle of whiskey, a soda siphon, glasses, and a box of cigars. The men appeared engaged and somewhat anxious. The captain was speaking. "Have you learned anything about them?" he asked Mr. Slatton. "Only what I've picked up from their own talks," Mr. Slatton replied. "I wrote to Morton asking him to look into it, but of course there hasn't been enough time for a response yet. From what they've said, one of them is Marlon Bostick, the junior partner at Edwards and Bostick, wine merchants on Gracechurch Street. That's the dark, square-faced one, the one who was here before. The other man is named Gibbons. He's a sharp one and holds a solid position in the customs department. He's had this launch for several years and has apparently made similar trips through the continental rivers on past holidays. But I couldn't find out if Bostick had ever gone with him before." "But you don't think they're onto something?" "I don't think so," he replied slowly, "but I can't say for sure. We believe Bostick noticed the number plate that day. I mentioned it to you, remember? Henry is certain he did, and Madeleine thinks so too. It's a bit odd that he's coming back, but I'll swear they didn't see anything suspicious this time." "You can't explain why he's back?" Mr. Slatton hesitated again. "Not with any certainty," he finally said, then grimaced and added, "But I'm a little worried it might be because of Madeleine." Buller, the engineer, suddenly gestured. "I thought so," he exclaimed. "Even with the little I saw of them this evening, I sensed something was off. I guess that explains it all. What do you think, Skipper?" The big man nodded. "I would think so," he admitted, looking relieved. "I believe it's just a false alarm, Slatton. I don't think we need to be concerned." "I'm not so sure," Slatton replied slowly. "I don't think we have to worry about Bostick, but I'm baffled about Gibbons. He's quite observant, and there's not much around here he hasn't seen at some point." "All the better for us, right?" Buller asked. "So far, yes," the manager agreed. "I've fed him stories about costs and about switching to paving blocks and so on, which I believe he bought. But why would he want to know what we're up to? What interest could this place have for him, unless he suspects something? They haven't done anything suspicious themselves. Not that I've seen. Never caught them trying to pry any information from the men. Never." Captain Beamish shifted impatiently. "I don't think we need to worry," he reiterated, a hint of irritation creeping into his tone. "Let's get back to business. Have you heard from Archer?" Mr. Slatton pulled a piece of paper from his pocket, while Gibbons instinctively leaned forward, thinking he might finally learn something to shed light on these strange occurrences. But just as the manager began to speak, he heard footsteps on the gangway leading on board, and a man started to climb the starboard ladder to the upper deck. Gibbons's first instinct was to retreat to his hiding place beneath the boat, but he couldn't bring himself to move too far from the center of attention. Before he knew it, he found himself quietly ascending the ladder to the bridge. There, he thought he could avoid being seen while still being close enough to hear what was happening in the cabin. If anyone followed him, he could slip around the cabin roof to the back of the chart house and remain out of sight. The newcomer knocked on the captain's door, and after a shout of "Come in," he opened it. There was a brief silence, then Slatton's voice carried out. "We were just talking about you, Henry. The captain wants to know." And then the door shut. Gibbons quickly slipped back to his earlier spot at the porthole. "By Jove," Buller exclaimed. "And to think that 2 years ago I was working a little coastal ship for 20 quid a month. And you, Slatton, 2 years back, you weren't much better off, were you?" Slatton brushed off the question. "It's good, but it's not nearly good enough," he replied. "This situation can't last forever. If we drag it on too long, someone's bound to catch on. What we need to do is get our supplies sorted and wrap things up before anything goes wrong. We should have that other ship operational. With another vessel and another depot, we could double our earnings, and I believe Swansea is the right spot for it. Buller and I were just discussing that before you came aboard, the captain replied. You know, we have thought about it repeatedly, and we always come to the conclusion that we are already pushing things hard enough. Our organization has improved since then. We can achieve more now with less risk. It deserves another look. Will you consider it, Skipper? Of course. I'll bring it up at our next meeting, but I won't guarantee my vote. In our line of work, it's easy to ruin the golden goose, and so forth. The conversation drifted to other topics, while Gibbons, exhilarated to his core, remained crouched silently below the porthole, focused entirely on the discussion, hoping to catch a word or phrase that might shed more light on the secretive operation being talked about. As they spoke about the venture, he lost awareness of everything around him, captivated by the dialogue. However, as the focus shifted to more mundane subjects, he began to subconsciously assess his own situation. He realized, first and foremost, that he was in genuine danger. Any sudden move from the men in the cabin or a crew member could expose him, and he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that his curiosity might cost him his life. He envisioned how the accident would be staged. Surely, his lifeless body would be discovered in the river, appearing as if he had drowned, with the overturned boat nearby serving as evidence of the supposed tragedy. And should he perish, his secret would disappear with him. Should he not be satisfied with what he had already learned and leave while he could, to ensure that his knowledge remained intact? He felt he should, yet the urge to stay and strive for more was too strong to resist. Just as he grappled with this inner conflict, the choice was taken from him. The men in the cabin were making their move. Slatton finished his whiskey, and he and Henry stood up. Well, Slatton said, it's 1 o'clock. We need to get going. The others also stood, and at the same moment, Gibbons climbed once more up the ladder to the bridge and crouched down in the shadows of the chart-house. Hardly had he settled in when the men exited the cabin onto the deck beneath the bridge. With a quick exchange of good nights, Slatton and the lorry driver descended the ladder, crossed the gangway, and disappeared behind a stack of pit props on the wharf. Buller mumbled a night and took the port steps down. Gibbons heard the door below open and close. The starboard deck lamp was extinguished, and finally the captain's door shut with a key turning in the lock. About 15 minutes later, the faint light from the porthole disappeared, leaving everything dark and silent. But Gibbons remained crouched motionless on the bridge for over an hour, anxious that any noise he made during his descent might give him away if the captain were still awake. Then, as a dim light from the rising moon broke over the eastern horizon, he carefully crept from his hiding spot. Crossing the gangway, he reached the wharf and soon found his boat. 10 minutes later, he was aboard the launch. Chapter 6. Gibbons quietly made his way down to the cabin and went to bed. Bostick was fast asleep, and his soft movements didn't disturb him. Yet Gibbons couldn't settle into sleep. He was too exhilarated by the adventure he had just experienced and the secrets he had uncovered. So, instead of attempting to rest, he turned his mind to the situation at hand. He began to sort through the facts he had gathered. First and foremost, his suspicions had proven correct. There was indeed some secretive and mysterious operation taking place within this group. This realization not only justified his actions thus far, but it also made it clear that he couldn't simply walk away from it. He was faced with a choice. Either delve deeper into his investigation or report what he had overheard back to headquarters. Next, it seemed likely that the syndicate comprised at least 6 individuals. Captain Beamish, who with his commanding presence appeared to be the leader, Buller, Slatton, Henry, and the 2 men mentioned, Archer, who had proposed establishing the depot at Swansea, and Morton, who had been asked to inquire about him and Bostick. Madeleine Slatton's name had also come up, and Gibbons pondered whether she might be a part of this group. Like his companion, he found it hard to believe that she would willingly engage in such activities, yet Slatton had indicated that she suspected Bostick had noticed the altered number plate. Gibbons couldn't reach a definite conclusion about her, but it was clear that 4 members were confirmed, with the possibility of at least 2 more. If that was the case, it suggested that their operations were of considerable scale. Educated men rarely embarked on risky and potentially illegal ventures unless the rewards were substantial. It was hard to imagine that any of them would risk their freedom for a meagre £1,000 a year. Instead, this hinted at profits ranging from £4,000 to £6,000 annually. Gibbons recognized that he was treading on precarious ground, even though the likelihood of his suspicions being correct felt strong. It was becoming increasingly clear that the entire Pit-Prop operation was a cover, a facade to hide the true nature of the activities fueling the money flow. Yet, when Gibbons tried to pinpoint what those activities might be, he encountered a more complex challenge. The notion of brandy smuggling resurfaced in his mind with renewed urgency, and as he reflected on it, he realized there was some validity to the idea. 3 key points supported this theory. First, the magnitude of the fraud stood out. A theft amounting to £4,000 to £6,000 or more per year suggested a significant victim, a large corporation. Such an amount would represent a considerable portion of the income for a mid-sized firm, making it unlikely that the theft would go unnoticed. Generally speaking, the larger the corporation, the harder it would be to track down the source of any losses. But what could be larger than a nation? And what entity is easier to deceive than a government? How could a government be more easily duped than through smuggling? Gibbons realized he was still speculating, yet the argument held some merit. The second point was also not definitive, but intriguing. All the individuals he had come across so far were involved in transport operations. The outward-facing business, the cover for what was truly happening, was also related to transport. If brandy smuggling were indeed taking place, a scheme just like this one would be necessary. In fact, it would be hard to find a more suitable disguise than the Pit-Prop business. The third point, which he had contemplated earlier, was that if brandy were to be smuggled, there could hardly be a better location than the region around Bordeaux. As one of the area's prominent products, brandy could be sourced here, perhaps more easily than in any other place. On the flip side, it was equally challenging to propose any alternative explanations that could account for the available facts. Gibbons couldn't come up with any ideas, but he knew that just because he couldn't think of something didn't mean none existed. Still, despite these thoughts, he had to admit that he hadn't seen anything that supported the theory, nor had he heard anything that could not just as easily refer to something else. Whatever their intentions were, he was certain that the members of the syndicate were desperate individuals. They were clearly too far in to back out now, even if it meant committing new crimes to keep their secrets hidden. If he wanted to continue his investigation, he needed to do so without raising their suspicions. As he thought about how to achieve this, he realized just how difficult it truly was. To a trained detective, this would be a challenge, but for him, an amateur in this field, it felt nearly impossible. He was particularly hindered by his close relationship with the Slattons, especially since he and Bostick had recently become quite chummy with them. For example, that very morning, they had planned an excursion to an old chateau near Bordeaux. How could he say no? And if he went, how could he keep an eye on the loading of the Girondin? He had suspected before that the Slattons' kindness stemmed from motives other than mere friendship, and now he was convinced of it. He no longer doubted that their goal was to sideline him, to create exactly the obstacle to his investigation that had arisen. Miss Slatton was undoubtedly involved in this scheme as well. He quickly concluded that the sooner he and Bostick distanced themselves from the Slattons, the better. Alongside this concern, he worried that with a cunning man like Slatton, he would eventually slip up. That thought led him to another. Would it be wise to keep Bostick in the dark about what he had discovered, at least for now? Bostick was an honest, straightforward man, open in all his dealings. Could he really disguise his knowledge from his hosts? More specifically, could he fool Madeleine? Gibbons had his doubts. He felt that under the current circumstances, his friend's discretion wasn't something he could count on. Ultimately, Bostick would seem more convincing in his ignorance if it were genuine. On balance, Gibbons decided it was best not to tell him anything. Once they were away from the area, they could share what he had learned and figure out what to do next. But first, they needed to leave. The next morning, he brought up the topic. He had braced himself for Bostick's strong opposition to any plan that involved separating from Madeleine Slatin, but to his surprise, Bostick immediately agreed. "I've been thinking we should leave too," he said, his grammar slipping. "It doesn't feel right to keep accepting kindness that we can't return." Gibbons nodded absent-mindedly and noted that if they set off the next morning, they could reach the Riviera by Friday. He dropped the subject until they stood at the Slatins' door, when he quickly asked, "By the way, are you going to tell them we're leaving tomorrow, or should I?" "I'll do it," Bostick replied, feeling relieved. The Girondin was busy loading equipment as they departed in the Ford, and the work was still underway when they returned later that afternoon. Mr. Slatin had excused himself from the outing due to business, but Captain Beamish had taken his place and turned out to be a surprisingly engaging companion. At the old chateau, they enjoyed a lovely outdoor lunch, after which Captain Beamish took several photographs of the group with his pocket Kodak. When Bostick announced their upcoming departure, it was met with a chorus of regrets. While the sentiments sounded sincere, Gibbons couldn't help but notice that no one extended a specific invitation for them to stay longer. That evening, the friends had dinner with the Slatins for the last time. Mr. Slatin arrived a bit late for the meal, explaining that he had stayed at the wharf to see the loading finished, assuring everyone that all cargo was now aboard and that the Girondin would set sail at first light on the incoming tide. "We'll have her company for a while," Gibbons commented. "We need to get an early start to reach Bordeaux before it gets dark." When the moment came to say farewell, Mr. Slatin and his daughter went down to the launch with their departing guests. Gibbons made sure to keep the manager engaged, allowing Bostick his chance to speak with the girl. Although his friend didn't reveal their conversation, it was clear the farewell had an impact, as Bostick headed to his locker, mostly silent. At 5 o'clock the next morning, the friends were up and about. Their first sight upon reaching the deck was the Girondin drifting down the river. They waved at Captain Beamish on the bridge, then swung their own boat around to follow her. A couple of hours later, they were at sea. Once again, they were fortunate with the weather. The sun blazed down from an unblemished blue sky, creating a dazzling path of light across the water. The surface was remarkably smooth, only gently rising and falling with the ocean swells. They were cruising about 4 miles off the coast, and aside from the Girondin, which was now almost out of sight to the northwest, they had the ocean to themselves. The heat made the breeze from the launch feel refreshingly cool, and both men reclined on the deck, lazily watching the water and savoring the gentle motion. Gibbons had secured the wheel but reached up now and then to adjust it slightly. "Wonderful, don't you think?" he exclaimed, lying back again after one of these adjustments. "A glorious sun, beautiful sea, just everything, isn't it?" "Absolutely. Even a landlubber like me can appreciate this. But I bet you don't usually have it like this." "I don't know," Gibbons replied absently. Then, turning to face his friend, he continued, "Listen, Bostick, I have something to tell you that will certainly pique your interest, but I'm afraid it might upset you." Bostick let out a contented laugh. "You've got my attention already," he said. "Just spill it." Gibbons took a deep breath. Excitement bubbled inside him as he prepared to share what had been weighing on his mind. "First off," he began, his tone growing more serious, "I owe you an apology. I intentionally misled you back at the clearing, or rather, I kept something from you that I should have told you. I had my reasons, but I don't know if you'll think they were good enough." "Just tell me. Do you remember the night before last when I rode to the wharf after we left the Slatins? You thought my suspicions were ridiculous, or worse. Well, they were far from that. I made a discovery." Bostick sat up, leaning in with intensity as Gibbons recounted his adventure on the Girondin. He held nothing back. He even repeated references to Madeleine almost verbatim, eventually summarizing why he decided to keep his discoveries to himself while they were still in the area. Bostick listened in growing dismay, his expression reflecting a horror that grew with each revelation. His mind was consumed by one thought, Madeleine. How was she affected by all this? Was she in trouble, in danger? Was she caught up in something she couldn't escape? The possibility that she might be willingly involved never crossed his mind. "My goodness, Gibbons," he exclaimed, his voice strained. "What does it all mean? Surely it can't be criminal." He paused briefly, and Gibbons inferred a different pronoun. They would never take part in something like that. Gibbons took the initiative. "I can't believe for a second that Miss Slatten would engage in anything questionable," he declared, "but I cannot say the same for her father." Bostick shook his head and let out a groan. "I know you're right," he admitted, surprising the other. I didn't intend to tell you, but now I suppose I might as well. That first night we visited, you likely don't recall, but after he realized who we were, he turned to pull up a chair. He glanced at you. I caught his reflection in a mirror. Gibbons, his face. It was the face of I was going to say devil, filled with hate and fear. But the look disappeared instantly. When he faced us again, he was smiling. It happened so quickly, I nearly thought I had imagined it, but I know I didn't. I noticed fear in his expression when he recognized you that same night," Gibbons responded. "We shouldn't ignore it, Bostick. Whether he's involved willingly or not, Mr. Slatten is part of this. That's as clear as day." "But what is it? Do you have any theories?" "Not really. There was that mention of brandy smuggling I brought up earlier. I suggest it only because I have no other ideas, but to be honest, I didn't see any proof of it." Bostick fell silent for several minutes as the boat glided over the calm water. Then, shifting his demeanor, he turned back to his friend. "I suppose we can't just leave it be. Is it our concern, after all? If we do nothing, we become complicit, and besides, we're leaving that girl to face this alone." Bostick clenched his fists as silence enveloped them once more. After a moment, he spoke again. "Did you have something in mind?" "I believe we must take one of two courses of action. Either we continue our investigation until we figure out what's happening, or we leave and report what we've found to the police." Bostick shook his head firmly. "Not the police, anything but the police," he said urgently. Gibbons stared thoughtfully at the coastline, stretching out before them. "Listen, my friend," he said. "Wouldn't it be wiser if we talked about this openly? I don't mean to be disrespectful, truly. I just believe you want to spare Miss Slatten and her father any trouble, especially for her sake." "No need to revisit it," Bostick replied sharply, his gaze fixed on the mast. "But if we have to be clear, I want to marry her if she'll have me." "I guessed as much, and I can only wish you the very best. As you suggest, we shouldn't involve the police, and since we can't abandon the matter, we must continue our own investigation. I propose that if we discover anything illegal, we should speak to Mr. Slatten and give him a chance to act before we report it." "I suppose that's the only option," Bostick said, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. After a brief silence, Gibbons continued. "I'm not entirely sure, but it seems we've exhausted our options here for now. I think we should look into the other end of things." "The other end?" "Yes, the unloading of the ship, and what they plan to do with the pit props. The first challenge we face is that these people aren't stupid, and the second is that they're already suspicious and will be watching us. There's a good chance they'll check to see that we really are passing through the Canal du Midi to the Riviera. We can't linger in Bordeaux without them noticing." "That makes sense." "Indeed," Gibbons added. "We've realized we made a terrible blunder by visiting the Slattens or by letting Mr. Slatten was aware of our presence, but at the time it seemed like the smartest choice we could make." "It was the only choice," Bostick insisted firmly. "We didn't realize anything was amiss then, and besides, how could we have hidden the launch?" "Well, it's done now. We shouldn't worry about it anymore, except that it strikes me that the launch has served its purpose. We can't use it here because the folks at the clearing know it, and we can't use it at the unloading point since everyone on board the Girondin would recognize it as soon as they saw it." Bostick nodded in agreement, silent as Gibbons continued. "I think we should leave the launch in Bordeaux tonight and travel back to London overland. I'll write to Mr. Slatten, telling him we found post-restant letters summoning us. You could add a note to Miss Slatton if you want. Once we get to town, we can check at the inquiry office at Lloyd's to find out where the Girondin docks in England. After that, we can investigate there. We can always bring the launch back to England another time. What do you think? That sounds fine, but we should definitely leave the launch in Bordeaux. We might need to return, and it would give us a reason to be around if anyone spots us. Gibbons let out a small sigh of relief. Bostick's response lifted a burden off his shoulders, not just because the suggestion made sense, though it was indeed practical, but because it showed where Bostick stood. He had worried that Miss Slatton's involvement in the matter would jeopardize his friend's support, even leading to a falling out. Now, he saw those concerns were unfounded. He felt a wave of gratitude as he realized they would work together as they had initially planned. "A brilliant idea," he replied warmly. "I must admit," Bostick continued thoughtfully, "I would have liked to stay around and see if we could uncover more about the lorry numbers. It might seem like a small detail, but it's the only concrete thing we have. Everything else is just speculation or vague hints. Here's a real mystery, something solid in our hands. Why were those number plates changed? I think it's a worthwhile lead." "I thought of that too, and I couldn't agree more," Gibbons replied, his enthusiasm evident. "But we have to consider that we're under scrutiny. I suspect we'll be watched closely, and our best chance of finding anything out is to prove we're trustworthy." Bostick nodded, and they went over the issue in detail, ultimately deciding to follow Gibbons's advice and investigate the English side of the odd dealings. By around 2 that afternoon, they rounded the Point de Grave and entered the estuary of the Gironde. The tide, which was in their favor, turned as they were about 2/3 of the way up, and by the time they tied up again at the same dilapidated wharf from which they had departed, it was already nearing 7 o'clock. Gibbons spoke with the owner and arranged for the launch to stay at one of his moorings until they needed it. Afterward, the friends went into town, had dinner, wrote their letters, and caught the night train to Paris. They arrived in London the following evening. "I've got it," Gibbons exclaimed later that night as they sat in his rooms formulating their plans. "I think we can track down information about the Girondin. My neighbor on the floor above works in shipping. He might have a copy of Lloyd's register. I'll go ask him." Moments later, he returned with a hefty book. "This is one of the wonders of the world," he remarked, flipping through the pages. "It provides, or is supposed to provide, details about every vessel over 100 tons that sails the seas worldwide." "It'll definitely be the Girondin," he said, tracing his finger along the columns. "Ah, what do we have here? Motor ship Girondin, 350 tons, built and so forth. The land's Pit-Prop Syndicate, Selden, Hull. Hull, my friend. There it is." "Hull, I know that place," Bostick said casually. "At least I was there once." "We're going to know it a whole lot better than that by the time we're done, or at least that's how it seems to me," his friend replied. "Let's hope so." "So what's the plan then? I'm in, as long as I get a good night's sleep at home first." "Same here," Gibbons agreed, filling his pipe. "I suppose taking an early train to Hull tomorrow is the plan." Bostick borrowed his friend's pouch and refilled his own pipe. "You really think that?" he said slowly. "Well, I'm not so sure. It seems to me we could easily get ourselves into trouble if we're not careful." "In what way?" "We all agreed that these people are alert and suspicious of us." "Right. So, once our visit is over, we change our plans and leave Bordeaux. Won't it seem to them that our interest in the trip was only for their benefit?" "I don't see it. We gave a solid reason for leaving." "True, but that's exactly what I'm getting at. We told them you were called back to your office. But what about that guy Morton, who was supposed to spy on us earlier? What's to stop them from asking him if you really have gone back?" Gibbons sat up straight. "Good Lord," he exclaimed. "I never thought of that." "And there's another point," Bostick continued. "We show up in Hull, find the syndicate's depot, and just hang around. The person in charge sees us. That would be fine unless they've gotten a letter from France describing us and including that group photo Captain Beamish took at the chateau." Gibbons whistled. Wow, this isn't going to be as straightforward as it seems, is it? Not at all, and we can't afford to make any mistakes. It's too risky. Gibbons stood up and started pacing the room. I don't care, he said fiercely. I'm going through with it now, no matter the outcome. Well, so am I, for that matter. All I'm saying is that we'll need to be smarter about it this time. They spent another hour discussing the situation and finally settled on a plan. The next morning, Gibbons would head to his office, meet with his boss to request an extension of his leave, and then hang around to talk to as many colleagues as he could, telling them that he'd been recalled but wasn't needed anymore. Gibbons wasn't optimistic about his boss being very approachable, and he was certain the subject wouldn't come up. That evening, they would head down to Hull. They intended to stick to this plan, but an unexpected event changed things. While Gibbons was at his office, Bostick saw the chance to visit his own and found out that Edwards, his partner, had fallen ill the day before. It seemed there was nothing too serious, and Edwards expected to return to work in 3 or 4 days. However, until that time, Bostick was needed, and he reluctantly had to call Gibbons with the news. Thankfully, no part of their planned holiday was wasted. Gibbons found himself fortunate enough to spend the same duration at work and could delay the rest of his leave until Bostick was available. Consequently, it wasn't until 6 days later than they had originally planned that the two friends finally packed their bags for Hull. They took the 5:40 p.m. train from King's Cross and arrived just before 11. There they checked into the George, a quiet hotel on Baker Street near the Paragon station.